Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Okay, I can see there are two people. Let's just give a couple more minutes and then get started. Okay, just 2 more minutes and then let's get started. All right, so of course we are in session 2 at the moment. The module that we are in is what is and is not Christian history. Essentially, we are looking at details which are needed for us to find out how we ascertain that a person or a group are Christians, where we draw the line, and therefore how we see something to be Christian and something not to be Christian. And in the previous session, we went through a quick list of obvious heresies which have been called out as obvious heresies, and we also looked at some scriptural details to lay the foundation for further analysis. And now, of course, we are in session 2, and in this session we're going to look at look at an overview of quote-unquote Christian history, an overview of what we consider to be Christian history in any sense of the word. Okay, I think I'm going to do this in 2 parts. One is really set the context, the historical context properly, which is to really talk about the political environment and and the likes first, and then in that context actually go through some details of what was meant to be quote-unquote Christian history. Okay, let me share my screen here. Okay, historical context. Of course, the period after Jesus Christ roughly split into 3 parts: the antiquity, the medieval period or Middle Ages, and the modern era. Antiquity is roughly going up to the time when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in AD 476, and from that point begins the medieval period or Middle Ages, going up to roughly the 15th, beginning of the 15th century, and from the 15th century is roughly the modern era. Now, in terms of studying Christian history, the main focus would be on the Roman Empire and parts of the Roman Empire. What used to be Roman Empire by the time Jesus was here, and what ended up happening to the Roman Empire and so on. So that's the sort of the context, the geographic and political context for studying this history. Of course, we are looking at an overview here. Okay, so to begin with, essentially, if you consider all the parts which are all the places which are recorded in scriptures, they are prominently sort of Israel, Turkey, sort of area first, and then going into Macedonia, Greece, and further west into Europe, Rome, Italy. So covering Roman Empire in that way. And we understand, of course, Roman Empire began just before, with an emperor. It began just before the time of Jesus, but it as a combined as one empire, it existed until 395 AD. In 395 AD, it was split into the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire. Before even the split, there was already, before the division of the empire, there was already a split for administrative purposes under Diocletian, which happened in AD 285. And then finally, after Theodosius won, the Roman Empire split into the West and the East. The Western Roman Empire, beginning from 395 AD, lasted only up to 476 AD, AD 476. So it was relatively short-lived, and it was subsequently captured by, in AD 476, captured by Germanic tribes, and briefly was taken back by the Eastern Roman Empire, and then only briefly, and then was divided into various little parts. AD 800 was the establishment of what is called the Holy Roman Empire, where the Pope declared Charlemagne as a Holy Roman Emperor, based in the which was supposed to revive the Western Roman Empire, and the empire was ultimately dissolved after being after reducing in size and so on, was ultimately dissolved in 1806 when Napoleon Bonaparte, in the period Napoleon Bonaparte took control over France. So that's in the West. So essentially it's United Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire, Germanic tribes, Holy Roman Empire, and then finally on to the Napoleonic times. In the East, unlike the West, the empire survived for much longer, The Roman Empire survived until much longer, going into even the times of the Ottomans. So like I said, Diocletian Tetrarchy 285, around the middle of 5th century or 6th century, Justinian the First was an emperor in the East, and during his time the empire was at its greatest extent. During his time, actually, they had control over Western Roman Empire also. They had taken back control from the Germanic tribes. And then we have the Bulgarians, Slavic people taking over Bulgaria and Greece, most of Balkans from the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantines, who are the Eastern Roman Empire, they had continuing war with the Sassanids, Persians, Sassanids, AD 602 to 628. Ultimately, in 627, the Persians were defeated by the Byzantines in Iraq. So this was a long ongoing war, ultimately won by the Byzantines, but at a great cost to their resources. Subsequent to the problems with the Sassanids, we have the Muslims, Arab Muslims, AD 635 to 645, took control over Syria and Egypt, which were supposed to be very rich provinces at that time. And the Byzantines had issues with the Arabs for a while. AD 718, ultimately the Arabs were defeated outside of Constantinople, which is the capital of the Byzantine Empire, ending the Arab threat in the east. But essentially, by now, the Byzantines have been fought with the Sassanids, the Persian Sassanids, and then now with the Muslim Arabs, and therefore they were severely weak. Ultimately, in AD 1025 was when Arab threat was completely eliminated. And now the Turks were already gaining momentum. Seljuk Empire essentially took control over all of Turkey from the Byzantines, AD 1071 to 1091. Now, during this particular phase where the Byzantines were fighting and losing territory to the Muslims and so on, you begin having support from the Eastern Byzantine Empire began having support from the people from the West in terms of crusades, where the Western, the Holy Roman Empire or Germanic tribes based area, people being asked to go on war by popes to fight and reclaim control over Jerusalem for religious pilgrimage and that sort of purpose. And through some sort of interesting events, AD 1204, the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, was actually sacked by the Crusaders during the Fourth Crusade. It wasn't intended to be that way, but it ended up being that way, essentially weakening the Byzantine Empire to a great degree. Ultimately, in AD 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans permanently. So that's roughly what was happening in the East. So in other words, until the Byzantine Empire fell to Ottomans, from the time of Theodosius, when or maybe we'll look at this briefly later, but essentially most parts of this could be considered quote unquote Christian in its nature. So that's roughly the politics of the antiquity and the Middle Ages. Moving on to the modern era. So Roman Empire, West, East, West, Germanic tribes, Holy Roman Empire, East, surviving a bit longer, and then Ottomans. And now enter in modern era. Renaissance began, Renaissance in terms of arts and science and so on. Age of discovery, AD 15th century. This is when essentially nations like Portugal, Spain initially, and then subsequently also the Dutch and the British and France, sending out exploratory teams across the world. Firstly for business, and then subsequently gears changed for move even towards colonialism. So AD 15th century to 17th century is what is typically called the age of discovery, and AD 15th century to 20th century is when mercantilism and then colonialism was spread across the world. So since AD 15th century, you began seeing a rapid, colonialism with, and then industrial revolution, 1776, the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's very important work called the Wealth of Nations, laid foundation for capitalism and free market economy. 1760 to 1840 was industrial revolution, division, what is called the division of labor. There were new ideas as to how manufacturing should happen, and machines were introduced and things like that. And so essentially this is the time when business thrived. Europe was producing things in surplus. They wanted to sell everywhere, and they needed raw materials for their surplus production. And so they wanted access to raw material resources. So both raw material resources and market for selling finished goods. And this is where colonialism came hand in hand with the age of discovery and with mercantilism and colonialism. Age of discovery resulted in colonialism, and that was related to the business endeavors also, and industrial revolution. So now you have new nations or new territories being occupied by Europeans, the Americas, and of course the various other portions of the world, Africa, India, and so on. In ADs 1775 to 1783, you have the American Revolutionary War. America, the US gaining independence from the British Crown. ADs 1789 to 1799, French Revolution. AD 1804 18 to 1814, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte becomes the emperor of the French. And through the period AD 1787 to 1888, you have the gradual work towards abolition of slave trade. Before 1787, with the nations, with the European nations, spread across different parts of the world and having access to the Africans, they began also doing the transatlantic slave trade. So business, money flourished, and labor, forced labor in the form of slavery also increased to a great degree. And so between 1787 and 1888, massive steps had to be taken, including by some prominent Christian leaders like William Wilberforce, to come against this transatlantic slave trade and slavery in general, and had to work towards abolishing that. So I've given some time points there in relation to abolition of slavery, AD 1787 going up to AD 1888. Beginning a bit earlier than AD 1787, both in Europe and also elsewhere in the colonies. So that's roughly the entire 2 millennia so far. Until 1500s, the focus has been on power, on religion, being straight religion and so on. And then from the sort of the 14th, 15th centuries, you have business, money, commerce, and then slavery, and then reversal from slavery, these sorts of issues in the main geographies we care about in terms of trying to study the supposed quote-unquote Christian history. So having laid that context, now let's actually look at some particular details in regards to the Christian history also. I say Christian now not to mean true Christian, but essentially to mean anyone or anything that identified itself as Christian. Okay, of course, in terms of going through the geographies, we go through the book of Acts. To understand that even during the time of Paul and Peter, the gospel essentially reached to a wider part of the world. We don't have records of many other works of the other apostles in scriptures, but we do have some idea from some other sources. So very early on, in the few decades that followed the ascension of Jesus Christ, you have the gospel reaching far parts of the world, like India, South India, but also mainly Arabia, Syria, Turkey, Greece, Macedonia, North Africa, some additional parts of Europe, and going slightly east of Syria, and south of Saharan Africa also. So the gospel had, over the first few decades after the Lord had returned back, ascended into the heavens, the gospel had spread reasonably well. We find plenty of details in the book of Acts. But we also find as gospel was preached across what was mainly Roman Empire, you had the church had to face severe persecution. The problem that the church ran into was that unlike the Jews who were following Judaism, the church was following a completely new religion. So Jews in a lot of ways had concessions given by the Roman Empire to follow their own religion. But Christians did not have that, mainly because the Romans didn't identify the Christian religion or their life as something which was ethnic in nature, i.e. historical in origin. When I say historical in origin, I mean as some sort of a long tradition that they were holding, because it had just started. So I think the Romans weren't really keen on allowing this sort of luxury for Christians. And therefore, pretty early on, even in biblical times, we see persecution begin to happen. Firstly, mainly because the Jews who rejected Jesus um, caused caused a stir among Jewish communities to which for example, Apostle Paul went to preach. So you see Paul getting into trouble in all sorts of different areas because of local Jewish persecution. But subsequently, that idea of Christians being sort of scapegoats was picked up by the Roman Empire also. And therefore subsequently persecution increased. So you see in for example the epistles that Paul wrote, Ephesians, Philippians and Colossians, are called prison epistles. He was in prison when he wrote those epistles, and the entire reason he was in prison was not for any criminal activity but for preaching about Jesus Christ. You see the first epistle that Peter wrote, Peter's main focal point was in advising Christians how to deal with persecution or suffering at the hands of the people in the empire at that time. So, 1 Peter, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and also even 1 John chapter 3 verses 13 and 14 highlight the fact that Christians were expected to be hated by the world because they really don't belong in this world. And so very early on, you see persecution rise, church grow a lot, and the gospel being proclaimed in various places. Christians did not have in the ruling authorities friends. So this is biblical times. Moving on slightly further from the biblical times, what we find is AD 64 onward, also there is persecution by the Roman Empire. I've given some particular details in the document. AD 64, persecution by Nero, who was accused of burning Rome, and he wanted to divert attention and accuse Christians for this particular fire. Tacitus records about this. AD 89 to 96, have Domitian persecution. Further down the line, you have Trajan. During the time of Trajan, persecution happening towards Christians, and recorded by Pliny the Younger in his historical work. As he writes to Trajan, in his epistles, asking about how to deal with Christians who were obstinate and were unwilling to leave their religion. And further down, you have Hadrian, who is believed to be the person who renamed the nation, believed to have given the name Palestine to remove the identity and association of the Jews with the nation of Israel. AD 161 to 180, Marcus Aurelius to Maximinus the Thracian, persecution continued. 249 to 251, Decius. Cyprian, who was considered to be a Christian leader, had to go into hiding, and there were plenty of people who betrayed or who turned their back towards Jesus, and there was plenty of controversy as to how to let them in to fellowship again and so on. During the Emperor Valerian's rule, also persecution continued. Diocletian is again a period where persecution was rife. In AD 311, finally, you have the Diocletian persecution of Christians coming to an end with the Edict of Serdica. AD 313, Constantine the Great becomes emperor, and he legalizes Christianity. Unlike what is popularly misunderstood, he didn't force Christianity upon people, but he legalized Christianity. In the AD 4th century, Theodosius I made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So essentially, from the earlier times, or from the sort of the first 3/4 of the first century, or actually from the from the first three centuries, with the church being a persecuted entity with no proper friendship with the political authorities, now the table was completely turning. With Constantine the Great and Theodosius, essentially in a brief span of time, from being the persecuted, now the religion is being accepted by people who were in ultimate authority. So beginning from this point in time, you find emperors both in the east and the west being patrons of religious activity, organizing councils and funding different endeavors and so on. You find patronage from these emperors. If we look at the church itself, by this time, by the 4th century, the early, I've given a couple of links in the document, in terms of early centers of Christian activity. You have the main cities: Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and many other cities in what I labeled as the in what was actually the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire combined together. Various centers of quote-unquote Christian activity. And among these, over a period of time, you have Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Jerusalem gaining more prominence. Bear in mind, Rome at that time was sort of the world headquarters, in a manner of speaking, in terms of politics and so on. And so the church in Rome grew to be a very, very large entity with plenty of people being Christians. And if we read the book of Romans in the Bible, where from a very early time, it would appear as if the church in Rome was a very well-behaving church at the start. Very well-behaving church, with being generous in what they did, and their faith being very ardent, and them following Jesus Christ properly. But what you begin also seeing is over these 2 or 3 centuries, you begin seeing people, individuals gaining prominence, specific individuals gaining prominence in various centers of Christian activity. Like I said earlier, in the first session, we read through various portions of scriptures, some of which alluded to the fact of how there were people, for various reasons, who were introducing all sorts of problems in the churches, even during biblical times. Now, if we sort of forward there, or go forward from there, we also find that problems, more and more problems came about. And this is when you find Gnosticism trying to take over. People like Valentinus and so on. We looked at this list briefly at the start of the first session. Gnosticism trying, and then in terms of movements trying to advance, or movements trying to undermine either the deity of Jesus or the humanity of Jesus, trying to take hold. Jewish movements trying to take hold and so on. And so the prominent leaders in the church had to contend against all these external influences. One of the very important problems which came in the 4th century was from a person called Arius. You might be familiar with Arianism. If you're not, it's pretty much Jehovah's Witnesses doctrine in the 4th century, sort of. Not the entire doctrine, but essentially undermining the nature of Jesus. So you essentially you begin seeing councils being sponsored by Roman emperors, with bishops, with leaders from various different cities being asked to come together to contend against issues, vote, and decide which way quote unquote Christians should go in terms of decisions. You find various Christians writing some material also. I've given a link there with a very, very spectacular resource, which is a 10-volume work translation, 10-volume translation into English of various Christian writers during the very early times of the church. But broadly speaking, our focus must be on this table. So essentially, remember, we're just painting a broad picture, a very broad picture of history here. And there were few momentous periods. I'm not talking about true Christians versus false Christians so far. I'm really commenting on anyone who call themselves Christians so far. And so essentially what you find is in AD 431, 451, and then in the 11th century and in the 16th century, momentous events happening. One of the councils called at the Council of Ephesus, there was a major split of quote unquote the church. Council of Chalcedon, AD 451, you have Oriental orthodoxies split. Until then, there was some sort of quote unquote communion between all these entities. Now they are split. Oriental Orthodoxy split from the from Assyrian Church had already gone away at the Council of Ephesus, AD 431. So essentially the church in the Sassanid Empire had separated from the church in the Roman Empire. AD 451, Council of Chalcedon, Oriental Orthodoxies split from the church in the Roman Empire. Oriental Orthodoxies include the Coptics in Egypt, Orthodox Church of Alexandria in Egypt again, Ethiopian Orthodox, Eritrean Orthodox, Malankara Orthodox in India, Syriac Orthodox in Syria, and Armenian Apostolic Church in Armenia. And then, so essentially you have three divisions, major divisions in quote unquote the church, going on up to the 11th century, when especially when the primacy of the Roman Pope over all of the church was advanced. Eastern Orthodox split from what is called the Latin churches, or Roman Catholicism. In AD 16th century is when, again, pivotal moment of Reformation happened. Reformation really was about going against the papal ideas about, how to be saved. And the idea of salvation through faith. I think there are six sola ideas: sola scripturas, sola fide, and so on. Faith alone, scriptures alone, and so on. 5 or 6 different similar ideas were advanced. Might know about Martin Luther. So this was a period of time when, by which time people were even paying to have sins forgiven. The Roman Catholic system had essentially brought in ideas that you can pay for your sins to be forgiven, and the payment went towards, of course, advancing Roman Catholic projects. Sometimes even participation in crusades was encouraged towards dealing with personal sins and so on. So this is roughly the Christian history. Now the question really is, we so far, of course, we haven't commented on particular doctrinal beliefs of these various people, and neither have we commented about leadership, behavior, teaching of the Bible, discipleship, and so on. But keeping those details aside for a moment, including everyone who called themselves Christians, this is roughly how we see things happening. I should also mention a couple of more things, and I thought I have the table somewhere. Let me see. Okay. No, I thought I had another table here, which I think is somewhere else now. Like I said, during this period, 8385 to 787, there were multiple councils which were convened to consider various problems relating to or issues brought up in relation to theology. Nature of Christ, the Popular Council of Nicaea, AD 325, AD 381, First Council of Constantinople, which again dwelt again on Arianism. Council of Ephesus dealing with Nestorianism, Theotokos. Council of Ephesus, which resulted in the split of the church in Sassanid Empire from the rest of the churches in terms of communion. So the idea of whether Mary was a God bearer or Christ bearer, issues like these, how to view Mary, how to view Jesus, all these issues came up and were attempted to be resolved in wide councils. AD 787, icons, usage of icons related controversy was being dealt with, and so on. So these were some historical events. 451 AD, 451, Council of Chalcedon was discussing about particularly on what they considered to be nature of Christ. There was Christ a complete human person and a complete God person coming together? How many persons did he have, and so on? There were issues like these sometimes which we might consider to be not very I wouldn't say useful, but sometimes which are very slippery slopes if we don't stick to pure scriptural edification and go on to other ways of examining things, sometimes which are slippery slopes in terms of understanding. But that's roughly the history of how things have been so far. Now today, of course, we find churches, quote unquote churches of various sorts. On the one hand, you have the Roman Catholics, the Roman Catholic institutions claiming that they are real church, that they are the only real church, and that everyone else has to be under them, under the authority of the Pope. And even today on news, you could see the Pope in Iraq trying to the Pope seems to be on a roll right now. He seems to be wanting to go and find support from various different quarters, even from people from different other religions, and so on, to gain prominence. So you have the Roman Catholics. Apart from that, you have the Oriental Orthodox. Like I said, even until today, you have the Coptics from Egypt, the Ethiopian Orthodox, the Eritrean Orthodox, the Malankara Syrian Orthodox from South India, and Syriac Orthodox from Syria, and Armenian Apostolic Church. All of them considering themselves as different groups. You have the Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and then in terms of the Protestant movement, you find all sorts of independent, quote unquote, independent churches across the world. Church of England being a major, Anglicanism, and Calvinism, Calvinist churches, and from Anglicanism you have the Methodism and so on. So the Methodists, the Baptists, and various different Protestant groups today across the world, going up to even small independent non-denominational fellowships. So that's how what began in the first century as the church has become today. Various different views, through history, coming through various different routes, with support from different empires, initially being persecuted. That's the path, quote unquote, Christians have taken, church has taken. The question we need to really explore is, which among these are truly Christians? Which institutions or which groups are Christians? And which institutions or groups are not Christians fundamentally? Because I think in the next couple of sessions, we're going to go through some very, very fundamental differences fundamental differences in doctrine clearly showing up in practice, showing up as differences in practice. We're going to go through those details in the next couple of sessions. And the question we need to be asking is, which of these are Christian? Which of these are not Christian? And that's exactly what we would do. Sessions 3 and 4. Yeah, so with that having said, maybe I'll open up the floor for questions at the moment. If there's any question. Amos, Dean, Gypsy, Jazz. Yes, Brother Amos, do have an email. You can send an email to info@operationstephen.org. info@operation Stephen with a PH, STEPHEN, Stephen.org. I think it should be actually in the description of this video also. Please do send an email. It'll be good to get in touch. Hello, Brother Jazz. Good to see you also. Is there any question on what we have seen so far? While we are waiting for any question, maybe what I'll do is I'll also briefly go through something else that I wanted to add to this. Yeah, in the middle of sort of AD 6th century, you have Rome, or the Bishop of Rome, asserting authority to be the sole leader of the worldwide church. He claimed to be the top guy, the pastor of all the churches, sort of in the middle 6th century. And even prior to that, Rome and the leaders in Rome, it would appear, whether they are truly Christian or not in other regards, I'm not talking about at the moment, but it would appear they were trying to assert authority, sort of a domineering mindset. So from that point on, you see the idea of Roman Catholicism claiming that Rome is the headquarters of the church, and that the Bishop of Rome is supposed to be the leader of the church. What followed from there are some important events also in quote-unquote church history, which ought to be borne in mind. AD 800 to AD 1806, you have popes declaring people to be emperors. They declared people to be Holy Roman emperors. So beginning from the 1st century, when Christians were persecuted by the Roman Empire, now you see the sort of the other end of the spectrum happening, where popes were appointing emperors. Between AD 1095 to 1291, you see physical wars being fought, battles being fought at the command of the Pope, crusades. Between AD 12th century and 15th century, you have Inquisition based in France, and 15th to 19th century Inquisition, Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition. These are really, Inquisitions are really where Inquisitions were really interrogations and persecution corresponding to what was deemed as heresy. So essentially, these were state-funded attempts to persecute people who were labeled as heretics. Whether they were genuine heretics or not is a different story. But even more fundamentally, the mindset there was through force, people would be made Christian, quote unquote, or issues would be sorted out. AD 1452, AD 1493, you have two important what are called papal bulls issued. Dum Diversus, AD 1452, and AD 1493, Inter Cetera. Papal bulls authorizing sort of expansion of territory. So this corresponds to the age of discovery. Going around to capture land, and also Dum Diversus corresponds to taking people who were not Christian under perpetual slavery. Essentially allowing slave trade to be facilitated from West Africa under the Portuguese. So as you could see, these were monumental in scope, politically, power-wise, persecution-wise, and taking territory and allowing slave trade to begin and flourish in Europe or associated with Europe. Massive things done, and all of them connected with quote unquote church. So these also ought to be considered in the context of quote unquote Christian history. And so our evaluation over the next couple of sessions would be based on all the details we have seen so far and some more in terms of finding out which of these are really Christian, which of these groups are really Christian in their essence, and which ones are not, even on a theoretical level. So coming back, any question that we have? Sister Alexandra says, thank you very much. It is very, very interesting. No questions. That sounds fine. Good to see you, Sister Alexandra here. Brother Jaswinder says, thanks, very important information. Thanks for your time, brother. Yes, my duty and pleasure. Apologies, I've been a bit irregular over the last few months, but otherwise it's my duty and pleasure. And thank you, Brother Jas and Sister Krina, for your continued support. And Alexandra and Amos and everyone else for your continued support also. But my wife, Annie, and myself, we are really thrilled to see where we are now, and the rest of the Operation Stephen team, thrilled to see where we are now, and all the possibilities concerning future from where we are now. Any further question or any question at all? Okay, if there is no question, I think we'll close this here. So the time is 2:15 at the moment. And let me check when our next session is supposed to be. 3 o'clock. Okay. So our next session is in 45 minutes. Okay, I still don't see any question there. So we'll close this here and essentially reconvene in 45 minutes. A different Zoom link for those who want to join via Zoom, and a different YouTube link also for those who are joining live on YouTube. So see you in 45 minutes. Sessions 3 and 4 will be evaluating the behavior of some of these Christian groups. Thank you.